You can't just flip coins for grades like you did last year.
But I've been here since 9 o'clock.
And doing what, huh? StarCraft? No way. What's that over there? Bikini girls!
But I've been working for 6 hours.
It doesn't matter how long you spend in your office. It matters what you produce. Manage your time better.
Let's start talking about time management with a short quiz. Your boss has ordered you to dig a giant hole in the ground. Who is the better worker? Someone who uses a soup spoon and takes 10 days to dig the hole, or someone who uses a power shovel and takes 10 minutes? If you think I'm asking the question to make some philosophical point, I'm not. Because I think the person who uses a soup spoon, if they don't have to, is an idiot. Both people have produced exactly the same result. So why wouldn't you use the power shovel if you have the choice? This is the first basic lesson we're trying to show you in this episode. Work smart. There might be other reasons to use the soup spoon. Maybe it builds character or it's more fun. But in terms of getting the job done, use the shovel. I have often had students who tell me, "But I spent 6 hours working on my paper." It doesn't matter how much time you spent on it. What counts is the result. Use the shovel. Teachers and parents are always telling you to work hard. What they should be telling you to do is work smart. Use your brain to find the most efficient way of doing things. So part of working smart is realizing that in the workplace, results count and not time spent. 1 hour of intense reading will result in you learning more than 4 hours of reading and playing with your cell phone. Now that you hopefully know more about your multiple intelligences, when you're faced with a task, find the most efficient way to get it done. Lesson 2 in this part of the episode is also important. Know your own body's abilities and limitations. What is the law of diminishing returns? The law of diminishing returns basically states that eventually, adding more input does not necessarily return the same output. For example, if you tell a joke and people laugh, if you tell people the same joke again, they will laugh less. And by the third time, you might get no laughter at all for the same joke. The law of diminishing returns is something Korean school administrators do not seem to have learned yet. The reasoning they use is this. If children go to Hagwons for 1 hour, they will learn X amount. If children go to Hagwons for 2 hours, they will learn 2x amount. This is what really happens. If children go to Hagwons for 4 hours, they will probably learn 3x amount. If children go to Hagwons for 8 hours, they will probably learn 4x amount. And if children go to Hagwons for 16 hours, they will probably learn 4x amount. Why? Because people are not robots, and we get tired. When you are working and studying, do not assume you are a robot either. Your body and mind will also get tired and they need food and rest. The best way to learn is to make yourself a reasonable schedule where, as the dean says, you work, study, play, and rest every day. But if you try to read and sleep at the same time, whether you spend 1 hour at it or 8 hours at it, you will likely learn 0x. We're going to continue to talk about time management by applying it to a very practical skill. Reading.
Now I want to tell you about a method for reading your textbooks that's going to help your textbook reading time be a little bit more effective than it probably has been until now. This is called SQ3R. We're going to take a look at it today, and I strongly encourage you to try it. First, let's take a moment to consider why I'm even telling you about this. The reason is, you don't read a textbook the way you would read a novel. When you read a novel, especially assuming it's a novel you're very interested in, you want to become very involved in the story. A good novel is one that you can feel in your mind, you can hear the sounds of the street where the characters are walking, you can imagine the sound of their voice, and you can see clearly what those characters look like in your mind as the story unfolds. This is true and good about novels, but it's not at all true about textbooks. Textbooks don't have interesting characters. We're just wanting you to be aware of that. In a textbook, if you're reading carefully every line and every word, you will end up paying too much attention to details that don't matter, and you will probably miss important things. You may get stuck, for example, on one word or one particular explanation, and maybe that explanation was not even a key point. And that's why we want you to learn about SQ3R so you can try to make the most of the time that you spend reading a textbook. To make your reading of a textbook more effective, you probably need a method, and if you haven't got one yet, today you will get one. It's SQ3R. Let's look at what it means. SQ3R has 5 parts. The first 2 you do before you actually read anything. You undertake a survey of the chapter to see what's coming up, and you prepare yourself to receive information by making some questions. The 3 R's refer to read, which is a particular method for how you read, and we will give you some tips here. Recall, which is something you can do to strengthen your memory of what you read, and typically recall is done right after reading. And then review, something for the long term, to help you refresh those memories that you got when you first read that chapter. So let's go through each step and see what it involves. Before we do that, actually, I'm going to take a moment to give you some information about SQ3R so you can see why we are choosing and why this method in particular is recommended. As you can see, it was developed by a psychology instructor. And in particular, the method of SQ3R reflects Dr. Robinson's understanding of how the mind works. And he focused in particular on 2 key things. They are, we tend to forget things, new information of course, right after we've just learned it. And you may find this happens to you sometimes now. Let's say you've read a whole page of one chapter in your book. If I were to stop you right after you read that page and say, okay, now look up to me, don't look at your book, and tell me what you just read. You may say, it was about this, and maybe you might remember the key word, but you may forget a lot of the important supporting information for that. And I do the same too. This is a problem that SQ3R tries to overcome. The other one is true reading comprehension. That is the ability to really say, okay, I really understand what I just read. This requires you to be able to confirm predictions that you've made about the reading, of course, assuming you took the time to make good predictions, and for you to be able to have some guesses, some good guesses, about what's coming up. And you may know this happens in a novel, for example. You may sometimes come to a point where you can guess, I bet the next big event is going to be blah, blah, blah. Well, this can be true about textbooks too. We're going to try to help you develop that skill. So, a look at the actual SQ3R. S, as we said, means survey. And it's a quick overview of the chapter and what the chapter involves. This involves a directed skim through the chapter. So you'll start first with the introduction. So assuming it's 1 or 2 paragraphs at the most, you would read that. Then you would flip to the back of your chapter and look for something like a summary or a conclusion or review, whatever, and read that too. And that seems obvious, but it's really helpful because the introduction tells you what's coming up and summary tells you what was spoken about in the chapter, and knowing, reading these two gives you a great idea about what the chapter involves. Then, after you've read those, you want to skim the pages. Skim through each page of the chapter. Don't read the sentences and things, but look for specific information that's clues to what's coming up. Look for all these things. See what are headings in large print. Look for any notes or icons or whatever in the margin. Take a moment to look at the pictures or charts. And if the charts have some kind of title, obviously, read that too. And also notice things that you see in bold or in special colors or italics, because these may be clues to key terms that you could make a list of, for example, in your notepad, and look out for them as you read. Look for any icons or symbols, little clip art that's trying to highlight particular items, and especially if the author has set aside a box with some notes on the side, take a peek at that too. This survey will give you a very good idea overall of what the chapter involves. So already, before you even bother to read the pages, the paragraphs, you have a good idea of what's coming up, and your mind is primed to receive that information. You're going to write yourself some questions before you read, so that 1, you've been thinking about the chapter, and 2, your mind will be ready, kind of geared up, to answer these questions as you read. And also, these questions will be a good tool for review later on. One easy way to write these questions is to go through each chapter heading and make it into a question of some kind. And by doing that, later as you read, your mind will be thinking about that question, and you'll be thinking, what's the answer? What is the answer? And you'll be looking for it, or that information which fits the question is probably going to pop out and become more noticeable to you, and ta-da, you're getting more out of it. So let's say you have to read some chapter, and in that chapter we have this heading called The Warren Court. So an obvious first question is, what? What was the Warren Court? Okay. The next question is, well, there's a chapter section about the Warren Court, so it must be special or important. So I could say, what made the Warren Court special? Or why was the Warren Court important? Something like that. Questions are important because they help you distribute your attention on different things. I'm not sitting there reading each paragraph equally. I'm going quickly through the parts that are not so important. We're going quickly through to get an idea of the main events, and then I go slowly through to get the information about the Warren Court or whatever it is that I wrote questions about. So, what do we have in store for you with Read? Doing this will help you maintain focus. You'll be refreshed. You won't feel burdened as you read, the entire chapter at one sitting. You can say, oh, I just have 2 pages to read, and then I can take a break. I can stretch, whatever. As you read, a couple of things to try. First is to ask yourself questions about what you're reading. Or stop after a paragraph and say, all right, now that paragraph, what was the main idea? Do this from time to time. Next, if you can, try to pause, maybe after reading a few paragraphs, and say, all right, how do I think this author will address that issue which was just mentioned? In what way are they likely to explain it? Recall. The goal of recall is to get you to try and recall from your memory, or remember, things that you just read. See how much you know to determine if you need to read more. Close your book or just simply look away and try this. Make yourself recite the key points, maybe explain those key points in your own words. If you have not done so, answer those questions that you wrote in the question step. If you already answered those questions, maybe ask your roommate or a friend to quiz you. Or you could make a list of keywords and ask yourself to define each of them in your own words. Now we're at the end. Review. Review can be done at the end of the chapter, or it can be done maybe a couple of weeks later. It could be done even before an exam, a final exam, or simply a test on the content of that chapter. So let's say that you divided up your chapter into several chunks and you've read each of them and so on. So try to now review the entire chapter and see how it goes. One way you might try this is to get a study group. You can even meet and do SQ3R together and quiz each other at the recall step, and then later review together at the end of the chapter. And that is the end of our introduction to SQ3R. I really hope, if you haven't done so yet, that you try it out and see if it can make your reading more effective, more efficient, and more helpful to you.
Another aspect of effective time management and working smart is reading according to your purpose. You don't use the same amounts of energy or the same strategies for every type of reading. For example, some reading is purely to find information. A web search, a phone book, reference material. In that situation, you can skim and you can scan through the material, and it's not necessary to read it very closely. You might read to stay informed. Again, you can quickly read selected articles and pass through them as you would with a web page. A reader may reread if something is interesting or difficult, but usually readers don't look up words. They tend to skim articles. You also read for pleasure. In that case, you might read more extensively. You might still rarely look up words or reread. There is no need for notes or review. The purpose of the reading is simply fun. For school, that's a different type of reading, which is much more intensive. Your reading will be slower. You might need to do comprehension checks. You might need to find unknown words. And you might take into consideration the SQR strategy that we've just talked about, by taking notes and by reviewing.
Another reading technique that you can use to your advantage is the technique involved with skimming and scanning. It's another active reading strategy that readers use depending on the purpose for which they are reading something. So, let's take a look. Skimming and scanning don't involve reading everything that's on the page, but they are a little different. Skimming is a quick reading, a quick skim over the page to get a general idea of what's the main idea of the text. We saw skimming when we were looking at SQ3R. Scanning is looking through only because you're seeking some particular piece of information. They each have more specific applications that I'll discuss in a moment. Before I do that, I'm going to ask you if you have some ideas now of when you should skim or when you should scan. To know more specifically, skimming is done much more quickly than regular reading. You're not reading every single word carefully. People often skim when either they are preparing SQ3R, therefore they're preparing for a longer reading later, or they have a lot of material to read in a very short amount of time. You can also use skimming when you're trying to decide if, for example, a news article or a chapter or a page of a book or something is going to be useful for research that you might be doing. So if you're looking up resources to write an academic argumentative essay, you might skim through what you found to see if it's useful and therefore worth reading carefully later, or if you should just skip it altogether and pick something different. Scanning is something you do, say, when you're looking up a phone number in a book of phone numbers, or you're looking up words in the dictionary, say a book dictionary, not your electronic one, or you're trying to find the key term that's in the chapter in your textbook because you just can't remember it, but you know it's very important. In most cases, when you scan, you know exactly ahead of time what you're looking for, so your eyes are passing over the page looking for that necessary information to pop up at you. It involves moving your eyes very quickly across the page. Once you've scanned a document to, say, find those keywords that you need, you might later skim it to see if it's worth reading more carefully, or simply to get a little bit more information because you know you can't take the time to actually read it thoroughly. When you're skimming, you need to do these steps. Read diagonally. For example, you may start at the bottom right side of a page and go skimming diagonally up to the top left. And then you may try that again. Start at the bottom left and go to the top right. This will prevent you from taking the time to actually read whole sentences, but it will still let your eyes pass over the page to get some ideas. You should be able to skim a page in about 10 to 20 seconds to identify the key words. Let words that are important or look special pop up at you, and then later, if you need, you can jot them down. Alright, now if you're scanning, it's best to know what you're looking for. As I mentioned, scanning is something usually conducted when you are trying to find a specific piece of information, such as a specific answer to a question or a keyword that you heard but you don't recall the definition. Okay? Know what it is you need to find. Keep that idea, such as that keyword, firmly in your mind, or if you have a question, keep the question firmly in your mind as you scan so that only that information will pop up at you. If you have only a vague idea of what you need to find, you're not going to scan very well, and you're most likely going to end up spending too much time because you'll end up reading too much and not scanning effectively. Therefore, be alert to find the information that's going to answer your question or define that key term or whatever it is, and do not let yourself get distracted. We're going to take a brief moment to try something skimming and see how it goes. Before I show you a paragraph, I'm going to ask you to do these things when you look at it. First, read the first sentence, and only the first sentence completely, and then let your eyes skim over the paragraph. Notice any words or phrases that might come up and seem important, rather, but don't read each word, and then read the final sentence. Remember, when you skim, follow that diagonal. Okay, hopefully that was enough time for you to skim. So, now ask yourself these two questions. Or most likely, if you were skimming anything, you would ask these kind of questions. What were some words or phrases that you identified? What do you predict will be the main idea? You'll see that paragraph again later, but hopefully you identified the word poverty or low income, and problems or poor development. These were some words that you saw in the first and the last sentences, and most likely they were used somewhere in the middle. So most likely this paragraph will show that income has some effect on development, like mental development, your intellectual development, perhaps even your physical development, like how tall and whatever you become. We also know it relates to childhood because childhood was one of the last words on the last sentence. Okay, now we've done skimming pretty well. We're going to try that same paragraph in a moment with scanning, okay? So now we're going to try to scan that paragraph, the same paragraph, and try to find this answer. Keep that question firmly in your mind as you look at the paragraph. How might poverty affect childbirth? If you've skimmed successfully, you probably noticed the word in the middle, low birth weight. That has to do with childbirth, right? How you are when you're born. And if you looked at that and you saw that words around it, you might have seen, children from poor families 1.7 times more likely to be born with low birth weight. So, there's the answer to our question. We skimmed through, it happened to be right in the middle and popped out at you, hopefully, and you were able to answer the question without taking the time to read the entire paragraph.
I'm going to leave you with a picture someone took of me when I finished my master's thesis in 1999. I'm not showing you the picture to brag about how many books I read, but to give you an example of what Professor Hall is talking about. I certainly did enough reading, but I didn't read every book you see here. Some I skimmed and others I scanned to find what I was looking for. If I had tried to read every line of every page of every book, I would still be reading, I think. So this is the lesson you should remember for today. Use the techniques we've covered, SQR and skimming and scanning. Try them and see if they help you read more in less time. And remember the general ideas we've talked about. You cannot do everything. Ration your time and work efficiently, and treat yourself like a human being and not like a robot. Play, laugh, and rest. But when you work, work smart. Don't read or study for 4 hours while paying half attention or using bad work habits. Read or study for 2 hours and think in advance how to do it right.